Hello and welcome. My name's Dan Sharp, Vice President for Community Research and Grants Management at the Columbus Foundation, and we are delighted to have you today for this nonprofit forum, Communicating Change, Messaging for Various Scenarios. It is the fifth and final within the series titled Leadership Succession Planning, Your Future Board Will Be Grateful. And this series has been presented by Carrie Millard and Lindsay Steinberg of Millard Consulting. Whether today is your first in this series or you've been to them all, we are grateful that you are taking the time to learn, to develop, and build the capacity of your nonprofit organization. Before I happily introduce today's presenters, I do want to cover some housekeeping that will govern today's nonprofit forum. This session is being recorded and can be accessed via the Columbus Foundation's YouTube channel. And within the week, a link will be sent to those who registered, which will include the recording and access to a Dropbox of resources from our presenters. Live captions are enabled and available within the Zoom platform. If you need to access those, please click the Show Caption icon on the lower toolbar of Zoom. We will utilize the Q&A feature for questions directed towards our presenter, so please find the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. The chat box should be used if you need to contact the production team about a technical issue that you might be experiencing. It also is found on the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. Q&A feature for the presenters, chat box feature for kind of back of house production needs. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Carrie and Lindsay. Carrie Millard is the founder of Millard Consulting, and across her nearly 30-year career is known as a respected authority on nonprofit board governance, planning, and fundraising. Carrie's firm, founded in 2003, is dedicated to building the capacity of nonprofit organizations and the individuals who serve them. And through this work, she has a proven track record of driving growth and fueling client success. And she continues those themes in her extracurricular work as a public servant, as a township trustee. Carrie has a master's degree from Indiana University, a bachelor's degree from The Ohio State University, and a certificate of nonprofit board consulting from BoardSource. Her colleague, Lindsay Steinberg, is the Senior Director of Client Engagement at Millard Consulting, and she is also a respected leader on nonprofit management, board governance, fundraising, and organizational planning. Lindsay is client-centered with strong training and communication skills and has extensive experience working for nonprofits in a wide variety of sectors. Lindsay has a master's degree from Loyola University and a bachelor's degree in business marketing from Miami University. And Carrie and Lindsay, I'm most grateful for the knowledge that you've imparted upon us and our audience members across this series. And I know that today will be an additionally wonderful complement to that series. And so the nonprofit forum is yours. Lindsay, I turn it over to you. Thank you both.
Great, thanks, Dan. As he mentioned, we're excited to kick off our final of the series here around communication planning and scenario planning. So thanks everyone for joining us. As a quick reminder, the mission, vision, values of Millard Consulting, our mission is to build the capacity of nonprofit organizations and the individuals who serve them. And our vision is thriving communities and families through highly effective nonprofits. Our values are mission alignment, lifelong learning, honesty and integrity, care and concern, and wellness. We build financial, organizational, and sector health. And we really believe that thriving nonprofits are essential for a healthy society. So we have a couple poll questions to start off. So our first poll question is, does your organization have what we'll refer to here as a crisis communication plan? So that could be, drafted key messages, talking points, streamlined communication for various crisis scenarios, including transition. So does your organization have some kind of crisis communication plan? Okay. So it looks like just under half said no. One person said maybe, and a few said I don't know. So it's about 30% at yes. So this will be the session for you. So we'll go through, the importance of a crisis communication plan, what that looks like, what some key messages and talking points might be for various scenarios. The next poll question: has your board participated in some kind of media relations or communications training at the board level?
Lindsay, we know how important this one is. So be interested to see how people respond to this one.
Okay, so 60% said no. Only one person said yes. Everyone else was maybe or I don't know. So sometimes, especially at that board level, as Carrie mentioned, it's really important, but it's overlooked. So we'll talk about the importance of that too.
That's an interesting one.
So then, does anyone on your board or within your staff have public relations or communications expertise? Certainly something you might want to look for in a board member, but also otherwise there may be someone dedicated on your staff with that PR communications expertise.
And I'll add to that, Lindsay, separate from marketing and branding, right? This is about the communications end of it.
Okay. Oh, well, good. So here we have 63% said yes. Only 2 said no, and then 4 were maybe or I don't know. So good to see that expertise is within the majority of the organizations. I mean, part of this communications planning is determining and understanding who's that spokesperson going to be, ensuring the communications are not only clear and drafted, but that they're streamlined through individuals that have expertise there. So it's important to know who your experts are in that area.
That's good.
And then last poll question, does your organization have a PR firm on retainer or one that's available as needed?
We'll talk more about this later in the presentation, but this one is such an important one, and it often gets overlooked.
So here, just over half said no, about a quarter said yes, and a quarter weren't sure. So as Carrie said, we'll talk about the importance here later, but as you know, in certain scenarios where they're especially sensitive, it's really important and beneficial to have a PR firm that can help guide through those if needed. Great. So a quick reminder here, the succession planning assessment. So the hyperlink that's through the Eventbrite to a SurveyMonkey assessment remains live. So you can always go in there and take that. And then a PDF version of the same assessment is in the Dropbox for use with your board. So if this is your first time tuning in here, there's an assessment that walks through kind of the readiness of the organization and where they stand in succession planning. So it's really helpful to take that to understand where your organization is, and also as a checklist for what needs to be done. And then a quick level set, a few reminders from some of the prior sessions here. So first of all, succession planning is an extension of strategic planning. This is a board responsibility and kind of an offset of the strategic planning process. So this is really a board-led and board responsibility. Also, succession planning is not synonymous with executive transition and search. So many times people think that when they hear succession planning, that means that you're actively engaged in a search for a new leader. Succession planning is the proactive portion of the full process, and the search is just one piece of that process. Third, succession planning is best accomplished when leadership is stable and the organization is not yet in that transition phase or that active search process. Again, this is proactive and you're trying to lay the groundwork for any future transition. So best when leadership is already stable. And then lastly, not all departures are planned, which is why we always start with emergency preparedness. That was our first session here around choosing an acting chief and ensuring that all plans are laid out for any emergency situations. And we'll talk about those transition scenarios here today too.
So we're going to talk about messaging now, and we're going to talk about some level setting messaging. So the rule number one, and you've heard us say this one before, the two most feared words in any boardroom are search committee, and the second most feared words are succession planning. Right? There's not a nonprofit board in existence that says, yeah, let's do a leadership transition. Let's launch a search tomorrow, right? This is big work. It's transformational work, and it's extraordinary work on top of day-to-day operations and governance. So we just have to acknowledge that boards don't, want to go into this work willingly. But as Lindsay had just said, not all departures are planned. So we have to think about this work as an extension of planning. And then we have to also align communication and messaging to that plan. And we'll talk more about that right now. But we have to first acknowledge that this is uncomfortable for boards and not something that's on the top of their to-do list. And then just as it's uncomfortable for boards, number two is it's uncomfortable for chief executives. Lindsay and I and our team have worked with a lot of chief executives who say, oh, let's not do this now. Let's do it next year. Or can we do succession planning, but can we keep it a secret? Can this be a confidential process? And ultimately what their fear is their fear and anxiety is that when external stakeholders and others hear that this succession planning process is underway, that might telegraph a message that the chief is departing. The chief might be afraid that that's going to minimize their authority, minimize their power, and they just want to delay it until they feel like they have more certainty to their time frame for something like retirement. They're just really anxious about what will this message send if others know that we're planning right now. And that is then tied to this very next one, which is then if they're not certain about when they're going to retire, if their plans are very loose and they're kind of vague, like, oh, I don't know, maybe I'll work for another 2 to 3 years, then the concern comes back to messaging again. How do I say that? How do I not lock myself into a time frame? If I say 2 to 3 years, but I really actually want to work 5 more years, am I putting an end to my contract? Am I telling the board that they have to do a search committee in 2 years? What if I'm not ready? What if I get sick? What if I in 2 to 3 years, I still love what I do and I want to continue for 2 to 3 years after that? So all of these slides here, we want to acknowledge that this is challenging to often talk about out loud. Boards are hesitant to do it. Chief executives are also hesitant to do it. So when we talk about the messaging here, we have to go back to that level setting slide that Lindsay shared and remember succession planning is an extension of strategic planning. Succession planning is a board responsibility. It is a board governance best practice. So then your messaging is tied to that. Our leadership is stable. Our board is engaging in succession planning as a best practice. We want to ensure that our organization is prepared for whatever future scenario comes our way. And it's just that clean. And if then somebody says, well, Bob, what about Bob? Is Bob announced his retirement? No. Bob is our CEO. our leadership is stable, which is why now is the perfect time to plan. So we just keep reinforcing leadership is stable, planning is a best practice, and so that we can minimize any of that uncertainty and take the messaging away from the CEO and their potential departure someday, and turn that messaging around to this is a best practice. Our organization, operates at a very high level. Our board is high performing. We've completed a strategic plan. Now we're doing a succession plan. So when you pivot the messaging away from the person and onto the plan and onto the practice of it, it takes the attention away. And if someone pushes, oh, come on now, surely Bob must be wanting to retire soon. He's of age. You just continue to say, no, those plans are not yet known. And this is a best practice. So just keep pivoting it. Lindsay, would you add anything there?
Well, I was just going to say an example. We worked with a client and just recently finished their succession plan. And this was one of those high anxiety situations up front where this leader was very nervous about this synonymous, perception of succession planning and search, and that people would think this leader was leaving. Once we got that messaging right, when we invited stakeholders into the process, I can tell you with certainty, we did not get a single question about the timing of the leaders leaving. It really truly shifted it to the process of succession planning and the proactive nature and the best practice of board governance. And the stakeholders were not involved or engaged in questions on timing of this leader leaving. And then we just completed that same plan. And I asked this individual this week how they felt about having the plan completed. And the anxiety was so significantly lowered. And in fact, it almost gave them, I feel like, the control back to decide the timing, because they felt comfortable everything was in place. If it was going to be tomorrow, everything was in place for that. They had the time to decide when they wanted to leave on their own time because they knew the plan was solid. And so the upfront anxiety was completely gone by the end. And in fact, I feel like it gave them a lot of comfort.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Lindsay. And that person in particular delayed, the scope of work because of these couple of slides here. But you're exactly right. It ended up empowering them.
Correct.
And the focus was on the process, and everyone in that organization, staff, board, the stakeholders, were engaged in the process, and they saw the value of it. And you're completely right, Lindsay. He now feels empowered. So this next one, our numbered level set here is, okay, your staff's capacity. Many of you answered on that poll, and many of you felt like you did have internal capacity. So who on your team, do they have a dedicated position? Do you have a director of public relations? Do you have a communications director? Or is public relations and communications embedded into another role? Does someone do marketing and communications? Or do you have an advancement person who does fundraising, marketing, and communications? Is there no one on your team with that dedicated title, but your chief executive is responsible for it? So I want you to think about your staff's capacity. Do you have messaging? Do you have communication? Do you have communications planning embedded in a role? Or do you have a dedicated role? Or is your nonprofit large enough that you have an entire team of people? And we want you to think about this. Lindsay and I work with lots of organizations, and many times communications is like, oh, well, this person over here, they can do it all, and the person wears many hats. But as we go through this session today, and as we talk about the intricacies and the nuances of many of these messages, you really want to make sure you have staff capacity. If your staff person is the one who wears many hats, let them go through some training. Let them get some sort of a credential. Let them go through, join PRSA, which is the Public Relations Society of America. Let them go to Lunch and Learns. Let them get a credential. Build their capacity so that your staff, beyond just the chief executive, has some knowledge, skills, and ability. Because if your chief executive is the only one with this skill set, And if there's a crisis or an emergency with the chief executive, who is the next staff person in line to serve as that spokesperson? So if your CEO can't be in that role, who will be on the staff side? And then the next one is the board side, right? What is your board's composition? Do you have public relations and communications? Is it on your matrix so that your governance committee and your nominating committee are looking at that skill set when it's time for board recruitment? Do you have any gaps on your board? If you do, please make this a high priority for board recruitment. And so, in our experience, when you can have a board member with a deep expertise in public relations and communications, again, separate from pure marketing, but true communications and PR, and have a staff person with the skill, you've now created a really powerful duo who can step in if the chief executive cannot be that spokesperson. And then this board person can lead board training. This board member can be the board spokesperson should something happen, and work hand in hand with the staff, especially in an emergency. So please do think about your board's composition. And then, of course, the PR firm. I hinted at this during the poll question. We'll talk more about this in our presentation, but I'll tell you, I have firsthand experience just even over the last several months with an organization that needed to put a PR firm on retainer. And the level of expertise that firm was able to bring, even though there was internal expertise, was a game changer. That firm was able to think in a way that the internal team wasn't thinking, because there was also, there was a situation happening, and that PR firm was a godsend. And so think about that. Do you have a relationship with a PR firm? If they're not currently on retainer, do you have a relationship with one? So should something happen, you can call them and they can be your partner through that emergency situation. And then make crisis communications and planning a priority for your board and your senior staff. Crisis communications planning is not just about succession planning. It is a risk mitigation practice. And, I will joke with our clients, I'll say, what would you do if Anderson Cooper was live from your organization's, front door in your organization's parking lot, reporting live because some horrible emergency happened, some crisis has happened, and the news media is there. Have you thought about those scenarios? We are all living in a world, very sadly, with active shooters. We are all living in a world where we just lived through a pandemic with public health crises. So please do think about having a crisis communication plan embedded in your organization. Have your board engaged in this. It's a great activity for a working group of the board, an ad hoc committee of the board, to do a crisis communication plan. Again, this is overall risk mitigation for your organization, not just about succession planning. I'll turn it back to Lindsay.
Yeah. So now we're going to walk through some specific scenarios and what messaging might look like for those. So this is a bit of a reminder. So there are 7 different transition scenarios: retirement, resignation with advance notice, resignation with little notice, a sabbatical, termination, a leave of absence, and death. And they're kind of color coordinated here to indicate, the ones in gray are more planned, more positive, right? The ones in the pink color are unplanned and negative, and then a leave of absence could be either. So we're going to kind of split these into those 2 categories and talk through what the messaging might look like for each. So planned departures. So in this case, it maybe isn't called crisis communication planning, it's just communication planning or scenario planning, right? Because these are not necessarily a crisis. These can be positive too. So a retirement, recruitment to a larger or more prestigious organization, going on a sabbatical, and the maternity or paternity leave due to the birth of a child are all positive and typically have advance notice and lead time to be able to plan. So that messaging then is going to look quite different. So if you're thinking about a retirement, so here's kind of a step-by-step of what we would think through in the messaging and beforehand. So first, in scenario planning here, determine the use or the need for an interim director. So again, this is not an emergency situation. You're not jumping to that emergency plan. This is a retirement. It's typically given with advance notice and planning time. So the question here would more be, is the timeline for retirement long enough that we think that the acting chief can stay in their role while a process for recruitment takes place? If the retirement is going to happen a little sooner than maybe that process you think will go, then you may want to look at an interim director to help take on the responsibilities if there's going to be a gap. The second one here, activate the talking points from the communication plan and potential scenario statement. So here, we'll talk through some messaging on the next slide, but what are those key talking points? You're going to thank them for the current person and leader for their time, for their achievements, and then inform the stakeholders on what the process is next. The board of directors is going to form a search committee. They're going to determine if there's a need to engage a search firm to partner with the organization and the search committee to lead the search. And then you want to also decide the executive director's engagement, their compensation, and their transition period. So this is something we talked about in a previous session, but this would all be done during a succession planning process, right? So you're hopeful that this has already been decided. What does the current executive director's role look like? Are they going to be engaged in interviews and reviewing resumes? Are they, going to commit to an overlapping time period with the new leader coming in? So you want to make sure that these decisions are made up front. And then lastly, you want to celebrate and you want to recognize the outgoing chief executive as well and make sure that it's celebratory and positive. So here's a sample statement. Join us as we celebrate the leadership and tenure of the individual, his contributions to the organization over X number of years. The legacy will have an impact for many years to come. In particular, we want to acknowledge and then you provide examples of accomplishment and achievement that have been achieved with his or her leadership. Join us in celebrating the individual at a reception on this date. And then a search committee has been formed and blank will serve as an interim chief executive during the transition. So again, just keeping it positive, keeping it factual, celebrating the individual, and also informing the stakeholders of the process going forward.
Yeah. And Lindsay, and I'll just add there, being able to say in this, statement that, the interim, chief will serve is really, really important, especially when we get to some of these other messages that are unplanned, but saying that up front versus saying, and we'll let you know who will be in charge during the transition, adds confidence to your donors, especially and other stakeholders.
So then recruitment and an advance notice resignation situation. So again, you want to determine the use or the need of an interim director. The notice, if they're going to a new organization, may not be long enough to conduct a full search. So, are they giving you a month? In which case, you're going to need an interim director to help serve while a search process is taking place. Or perhaps their notice is longer, and you think that the current leader can stay through the search process. So you're going to have to determine the need and the use for an interim director to come in. You're going to activate the talking points from the communication plan and the potential scenario statements. The board of directors is going to form a search committee and decide if they want to use a search firm. And then you're still going to celebrate and recognize the outgoing executive director, even if they're going to another organization. So a sample statement here, it might look like this. The board has accepted X's resignation as chief executive with mixed emotions. We're saddened to lose their leadership, but we celebrate their accomplishments. We wish them well as X takes on the chief executive role at this new organization. Join us in celebrating them at a reception on this date. And again, a search committee has been formed and X will serve as an interim chief executive during the transition. So very similar, you can see the format here, but coming in with the appreciation up front and making sure that you're instilling that confidence in the community and the stakeholders with what the next steps are and who's going to be overseeing the leadership. So unplanned departures, the more negative situations and unplanned. So a resignation, often with little notice, or a termination are typically negative. they can have an impact, a trickle-down impact on the culture and the morale, and impact on other staff members. Could also have an impact on fundraising and donor relations. So it's more than just an individual leaving, right? There's really a broader ripple effect on other stakeholders internally and externally in these situations. A medical or family leave, such as a sudden or acute illness or the death of a chief executive, are unique circumstances that can be very difficult to manage, as you can imagine. They're hard to communicate and overcome. And so these are the situations where, as Carrie alluded to earlier, bringing in a PR firm or something in these really sensitive and emotionally sensitive situations, and sometimes legally sensitive situations, you really want that expertise of a PR firm to be helping review the messaging to ensure that it's accurate and appropriate.
Yeah. And Lindsay, I'll just add here real quick, we can't underestimate the human side of this. These unplanned departures, if it's a termination because of some scandal, then there's anger. If there's an acute illness or someone passes away, then there's, grief and sadness. And so all of the humanness to these especially add a level of complexity to the communication. Sometimes you need legal review, to the communication, but just not forgetting the human side of this. And so the more of this that can be done as an evergreen kind of standard statement that you have at the ready, or as Lindsay mentioned, you have that outside counsel with a PR firm to help you think about it, the better, because, these next few slides, these are difficult scenarios. And I think all of us, as we talk through these next few slides, can think of some examples in your work, in our professional lives, in our community, where these things have happened. And so you understand the nuance and the complexity of these.
So little notice resignation. So here, with little notice, you're going to want to activate that emergency plan. And in that emergency plan, as you'll remember, it's identified who the acting chief will be. And again, the acting chief is going to be someone specifically for emergency situations. They're very different than the interim chief. The acting chief is someone who can continue business operations, right? They understand, they have the passwords, and they can continue the payroll, and everything continues to run. So that role and that individual is often quite different than who an interim chief might be. The acting chief is often someone who may never want to be, or feel that they would be appropriate to be the next chief of the organization. So ensuring that you activate that emergency plan and that acting chief is identified is step number one. Then you're going to activate talking points for the crisis communication plan and the different potential scenario statements. And again, these talking points look quite different, right? You're still going to be factual. You're still going to be informing the community and the stakeholders and reassuring them. But the emotional part of it looks very different, of course, here. You want to understand and discuss the ethical or legal implications. And this is, again, where pulling in outside PR firms, legal counsel are going to be really important depending on the situation to ensure that those concerns are understood, the implications are understood, and then the messaging is appropriate. Next, determine the transition plan if other senior staff leave. So as I mentioned early on, there's often this ripple effect of little notice resignations. There was turmoil within the organization, perhaps. The leader leaves very quickly. Do they have staff members that are shaken by this that also want to leave? So here I'll point out, it's really important in your emergency plan that you also have a backup acting chief, which when we do this with our clients, they're like, really, we need a backup to the backup? But you do, because sometimes and oftentimes there could be a situation where your chief and the acting chief are quite close, or that there's an impact on them both. So having a backup to the backup, as silly as it sounds up front, is really critical here, because it's not unheard of that other senior staff can leave in some of these situations. Decide the board's role and the need for emergency sessions on the board side. And what does that look like? And then the board of directors is again going to form the search committee. So a sample statement here. The board has accepted the resignation of X effective immediately. We are not at liberty to discuss the details of the personnel matter. If needed, we are investigating allegations or cooperating with authorities to determine. So that would be, of course, if that was necessary. The board remains committed to the mission, and our focus is on the search for the new leader. During this time, X will serve as the acting chief executive, and X will take on any additional duties. So quite factual, and keeping the emotion out.
There's an example here in town where there was a little notice resignation. The CEO resigned really at the request of the board, and it made headline news. And I remember in the Columbus Dispatch article, the quote from the board member that said, the board will, be in have an emergency session, and, the interim leader or the acting chief will be announced shortly, kind of a thing. And it just screamed off the page of, this board did not have a plan. This was caught everybody off guard. And in talking to some other stakeholders in the community, it further eroded confidence in the board and the organization, that they weren't even able to say that, Susie is going to step in as acting chief during this time of transition. The fact that they didn't have that in place further added concern about
Oh, are we still there? It looks, I think Carrie and I somehow got frozen or booted off here.
Glad it seems like we're reconnected. There was a
There we
hiccup.
go. Yeah.
And so
I think we
let's
lost the
rewind to Carrie's point about those things coming off of the dispatch page of board unprepared in the example that she was giving from a local organization, and we should be right back on track.
Yep, I think, Dan, I can try to share here while we wait for Carrie to jump back on.
Great, thanks, Lindsay.
Yep. Okay, here. So we were. Great. Okay. So continuing talking about the little notice resignation here, I think we had talked about this in pretty good detail. Sorry here. But the next situation similarly would be, a termination, right? So again, when you're thinking about messaging, you really want to work on establishing the trust of the stakeholders, as we've noted, and refusing to speculate. So whether it's a leave, a short-term announcement that there's a departure, a resignation, or a termination, the goal remains the same. And the process also, and the steps listed here are also quite similar. So again, you're going to activate the emergency plan. You're going to activate the talking points in the crisis communication plan and potential scenario statements. You're going to, speak with your PRs and your legal experts to understand and discuss the ethical and legal implications of the termination. Determine the transition plan, again, if other senior staff leave due to the termination. Decide the board's role and need for emergency sessions. And then the board of directors is going to form the search committee. So, these are the critical steps again, and just ensuring that you're continuing to try to build that confidence with the public and the stakeholders. Let's see here. A sample statement here might look like, after deliberations with the board and legal counsel, we have dismissed X as the chief executive of the organization. We're investigating allegations of X and are committed to cooperating with authorities. We're committing to holding our leadership accountable as we steward our mission through this challenging time. And during this time, X will serve as the acting chief executive, and blank will take on any additional duties. So this is a sample statement here. And another big piece of communication planning that, we talked about a little bit earlier when thinking about who the experts are, is ensuring that not only are the messages, drafted, set up, clear, vetted by legal counsel if needed, but also that you have identified who those spokespeople are going to be in these especially sticky situations, right? So you don't want your board to be able to go rogue and they're talking to the media and they're saying different things. In an emergency plan, you have laid out and established who the primary spokesperson with the media and communication with stakeholders individual is going to be. The board needs to be aware of who that person is. There can be a representative of the board, perhaps the board chair who takes on that role for the board, but it needs to be really clear what that streamlined communication looks like, and especially in these challenging situations, to ensure that the messaging isn't getting confused and that people aren't kind of going rogue out with the media and the community and sharing messaging that's, off message. Are you back, Carrie?
I'm back. I'm so sorry. The power went out.
Yeah, we
at
both got
home.
dropped, Carrie. I don't know how. It was really weird.
Sorry about that. I'm back.
So we just finished termination. Anything else you want to add there about just streamlining and deciding up front who the individual will be that will be the communication spokesperson?
Yeah, I know you've got it right. You've got it right.
Okay, so next here would be the really unfortunate and tragic situation of a death, which sadly we know examples of this too. This is that whole emotional complexity, that Carrie talked about a little bit ago. The steps look largely the same, but the emotion is quite different, right? So again, you're going to activate that emergency plan that identifies the acting chief. You're going to activate your crisis communication plan that has some drafted key messages and talking points, which of course are going to change and be edited based on the scenario and specific situation. You're going to activate talking points in the crisis communication plan on potential scenario statements, determine who will be the lead memorial planning and when remembrances will take place. And then the board of directors is going to form a search committee again. I think when I think about messaging here, though, you want to express, your appreciation for the work, the sadness, and all the emotion in the messaging, but also it's helpful to express how the staff are being supported, right? How the organization and the individuals at that organization are being supported in managing through this tough situation. Talking about how the board will ensure that the organization continues to function and the staff are supported is a really important message that you'd want to add in any kind of tragic situation like this.
Mhm.
And so a sample message here could look like this. With profound sadness, we share that X has passed away. We send our deepest sympathies to the family and to the larger community whom X was dedicated to serving. Funeral arrangements are X. X will be serve as an acting chief for X months to allow for the time for the staff to grieve. So a sample statement there, but ensuring that emotional component is there, but while also staying factual.
Mhm. And, I'll add to this one, Lindsay, sometimes with someone passing away, it's sudden, right? And you have the shock mixed in with grief. Sometimes it's the result of an illness. So we have a client whose former CEO had breast cancer. So she got sick, she went through chemotherapy, and then she got better. But then, then she did pass away. And so that kind of roller coaster and, navigating her health journey. And when she got sick, and she was quite sick and chemotherapy plans and things were not in place. And so my client she was telling me about it, in that moment when she was in chemotherapy, she was writing up a job description. She was writing out communication messages. She was doing all of these things, which was just kind of horrible. And then, so sometimes with this, there's just, because in her case, she had breast cancer. And so you do have some time, but again, that human toll when someone is sick or they're faced with a diagnosis, that is not the time to be putting pen to paper.
Yeah, and as you've said before, you're not acting rational, right? So that having these messages and at least something drafted is it's not a blank page, right? In a moment of personal crisis as well.
Right.
One, last thing here when thinking about different scenario situations, especially those unplanned ones, like termination or little notice resignation, is also thinking about the implications on key stakeholders, as we've noted, and donors, but who's reaching out to them? So we've talked about the importance of having a spokesperson, but do you have a running list of those key stakeholders that need to be the first to know, that need, or they need that in that first follow-up call once the news has gone out? We've been in situations like this where the message has gone out, and then we have, we've hit the phones, right? And we've called, the key donors or the key stakeholders to the organization to ensure that they get a personal communication, right? That just helps, instill that confidence in the organization and that they're stable. So part of the communication plan is, not only who's doing the communicating, but who's being communicated to, and who's on, that short list of key stakeholders that need to be contacted immediately.
Oh, Lindsay, I couldn't agree more. And this is where your board members can come in, right? So if you have a handful of board members and you have your top list of major donors, key stakeholders, maybe elected officials, and you have different board members calling these folks, and these folks before the news is out on social media or it's in the Columbus Dispatch, Lindsay, I couldn't agree more. Thinking about who gets to hear this message first is absolutely critical. And please bring your board members in on that so that you can ensure as many of your key stakeholders can hear about it personally before they read about it.
Great. Can you see
So-
this? Okay.
I can, yep. So again, apologize for the power going out, and now I'm on my phone because the internet is still out. So we'll talk about PR firms and expertise here. Working with a PR firm or a consultant, a single shingle, right? Someone who has this expertise, who works on their own, whether you have them on retainer now, or you build that relationship with them now and have them at the ready, is going to add expertise to your organization. The example that I mentioned earlier, the organization that I'm involved with, and a crisis happened, I was able to pick up the phone and call this PR firm because of a long-standing relationship. They took my call. I told them what was happening. They immediately understood. And, we were on retainer in 2 minutes flat, and, scheduled the first, emergency planning session. And, we didn't miss a step. And so I want you to really think about who would you be able to call if you don't have a firm on retainer. If you don't have a relationship with a public relations consultant or with a firm now, I want you to build that, add that onto your to-do list. Again, thinking about this, not even just with succession planning, but as in terms of risk mitigation. It's a really important strategic decision, even if you have that internal staff expertise, regardless of whatever the scenario is that comes your way. And, the field of public relations has changed dramatically. Media relations 20 years ago is very different than it is today. And so if you have someone on your board, who used to do this work and they've been out of it, they don't have the same knowledge of how this industry works today and how lightning fast, communication messages can get out and spread on social media before you've even finished writing the press release, and the way public relations used to happen. So, the speed that a message can get spread, the speed that the wrong message can get spread is, lightning fast, right? It is milliseconds today. So I really want you all to be thinking about what is that external capacity, who can I call? And then internal capacity, what is that expertise of your team? Do they have that expertise now? Do they need additional training? Do you need to review job descriptions? Do you need to make sure that this is embedded in one role or several roles? And then who is that spokesperson going to be? Typically the chief executive is the spokesperson with a staff lead. But if the chief executive is incapacitated, if the chief executive is at the center of a scandal, then who else will play that role? And then, of course, your board. And we've touched on this before. Who on your board has this expertise? Have you provided the board training? Make sure that you have, plans in place. Boards have an obligation to ensure that plans are in place, that you have policies and protocols for who the spokesperson is. No board member should be speaking to the media other than your board chair or whomever that spokesperson is, that designated board member. We can all think about examples of Columbus Dispatch articles that we've read where multiple board members were quoted and they shouldn't have been. You want to make sure that this training happens when things are stable again, so that should a crisis occur, that everybody understands the protocols, everybody's clear on who that spokesperson is. And then we'll go to closing here, and we always want to close on a quote, and this came from a client. Everything is different. We don't know how to talk about the organization without her at the helm. And this was referring to someone who had passed away. And again, this person personified the organization. And so it was really difficult emotionally because of her passing, but even just thinking about how to talk about the organization was different. So having some of these, we call them evergreen statements, some messages in place, having a plan in place, so that again, you don't underestimate the human toll and the challenges ahead. And we'll go to Q&A.
While folks go to the Q&A chat box on the bottom of the Zoom tab to submit those, we'll dive in on that front. Kind of jumping off from that quote there, Carrie, earlier on slide 27, you were talking about the unplanned departures and the differentiation between those unplanned that might be a termination, untimeliness, unsavory scenarios versus a death after either an illness or a sudden loss of the leader. And the word that you gravitated to was the humanness. Do you find that the communication and the timelines and just generally the response, once you look beyond the grief, that organizations have greater flexibility and latitude and empathy around such a loss because of that humanness, maybe compared to the inquisition, the curiosity, the pointed questions? What does that latitude look like for an organization and its leadership in those two different examples?
Oh, Dan, absolutely. There is a lot of grace given, right? We are all, we're all living the human condition, right? And we're all living this journey together. So absolutely, when there is a passing away, there is tremendous grace given. But with that grace, there are still levels of concern. That quote, that organization was personified by their CEO. So there is still this concern of, will this organization survive? Will this organization, regress? Will there be a loss of donor and, giving and enthusiasm because now that beloved leader is no longer there? So there certainly is grace, but there still is this undercurrent of what now? What happens next? you know, and concern. But you're exactly right. If we pivot to the termination or to the scandal, then there's not the level of grace, there's the inquisition. You know, there was the inquisition. Sorry, guys. You know, who's at fault? What happened? Did the board know? Should they have prevented this? Did they know sooner and they're just waiting to tell us now? You know, all of those kinds of levels of questioning happen. And if it is something unethical or illegal, then you've got, you know, very limited things that you can say if there is an investigation. You can't say certain things, then that just further adds to the questioning. And frankly, it goes back to the board, right? What did the board know? You know, were they aware? What did they do? Did they wait too long? And so, Dan, it's a very good question.
An additional question, you mentioned board throughout the board's role throughout the presentation, and you did a special call out for kind of search committee or even selection committee at times of transition. Where in there is the role of an executive committee?
Well, that is a really good question. And that, in fact, Dan, that could be a whole other nonprofit forum. So an executive committee can be problematic. I will tell you this, especially in a crisis. And you might say that sounds absolutely counterintuitive, because an executive committee is that small group of people, they're leaders, right? They are the officers of the organization. That's who should come together in a crisis to help navigate the organization through these uncharted waters. But we would argue, and Board Source would argue, especially in a crisis, you need the talent, the wisdom, the skill of every single board member, not just of a select few. And I will tell you, when there's too much reliance on just a select few in an executive committee, that can create a power dynamic, and that can further erode confidence. That can also mean that only a few people are in the know. That means then the rest of the board is unaware of what is being discussed in that small group. And then you can get those quotes in the dispatch from a board member who says, I don't know what's going on. You know, only the executive committee's in the loop, right? That's the last thing you want to. So we caution against, and Board Source recommends cautioning against, a very strong, powerful executive committee that's always in the know. Especially in the time of a crisis, you need the talent of every board member. You need to be gathering every board member together. Everybody needs to be on the same page. And then you select which members of the board will serve on the search committee, or which member of the board will serve as a spokesperson. But we want to caution against an over-reliance on a select few.
Thank you for that insight. Lindsay, you want to add anything?
I was just going to add just the power dynamic piece. Carrie just reminded me of, you know, outside of the executive committee, but the search committee itself, and just ensuring too that it's clear what their authority is as the search committee. So once you have determined who that is, keeping in mind, as Carrie's noting, this is a full board decision, right, on the transition, the selection of the next leader. So that search committee is going to help facilitate the process, but they are ultimately not the only decision makers, right? The full board is voting on the next leader, and they're, you know, approving the compensation, benefits, all of the things. So, you know, making sure whether it's the executive committee or the search committee, that there's not an over reliance on any particular committee in the whole process.
That's right.
Great.
That's
well,
right.
you gave wonderful real world examples, responses to those real world examples and some great resources between PRSSA for public relations oriented trainings for individuals, not to be confused with marketing and communications function, as they certainly are different. Great examples today of how to structure those subcommittees of the board, the full board, to ensure instilled confidence and transparency in the process. And so Lindsay and Carrie, I want to thank you both for the content and also real life crisis planning, if you will, and pivoting to see the content through to delivery.
Right.
We're so grateful for your partnership in the Nonprofit Forum series and grateful for all of the work and professionalism that you bring to your numerous clients across Central Ohio and all that you do for the sector as a whole. And so thank you on behalf of the audience today, the audience that will consume this information as it lives on YouTube, and from the Columbus Foundation. Thank you both for your participation and assistance and leadership through the Nonprofit Forum platform.
Well, and thank you for your patience with our technical glitches today and
No
a
problem.
growling dog. And Dan, for your partnership. We love doing these forums, and at any time, anyone's welcome to reach out to us with questions. We're happy to be of service.
Great. And as a closing reminder, there will be a follow-up email that will have resources via Dropbox link. There's a survey about your experience with the forum, as well as then access to the recording to share ideally with your colleagues and your board members. So wonderful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
Thanks so
Enjoy the
much.
rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.